Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Forge Road Bible Chapel. Thank you for choosing to be here this morning. I actually came down a little early this morning. I had a copy to make, and it was pouring rain. It was like 8:15, and I just threw on some shorts and a t-shirt and flip-flops, and I walk in the door, and I realize I'm dripping wet, so I kick the flip-flops off, and I walk in barefoot, and Paul's standing here getting ready for music. He's like, "Tell me that's what you're wearing today." And I don't know. Maybe if I wore shorts, then everybody started doing it. Next thing you know. On a more serious note, as has been mentioned, this Sunday does fall on one of those dates that we just remember as a number, 9/11. And as you know, 21 years ago, several passenger jets were hijacked and flown into buildings. Thousands of people died. And it set off a lot of events that dominated the news for weeks and months, if not years. It was not uncommon to hear the phrase, "in light of 9/11. We heard that over and over and over. Everything was touched by it. I remember being told by adults as a kid that they remember where they were when Kennedy was shot. And this was kind of our generation's memorable moment. Everybody remembers where they were. I remember distinctly where I was on September 11th, 2001. I was skipping school. My then girlfriend, now wife, Cassandra, and I had cut a few days of classes, only half a week. Responsible students, we went with her parents and siblings to a lake in Minnesota. It was early September. It was beautiful, and we were enjoying the outdoors and activities together. And that morning, I was awakened by worried voices, and then, like everyone else, we spent the next 3 days watching the news, and we were specifically trying to figure out how we're going to get back to school because airports were closed everywhere. Thankfully, classes also had been suspended. We didn't miss too much, but when we finally got a flight, the line through security was 3 hours long, and I lost a very nice pair of fingernail scissors that I'm still a little sore about because they were like that big of a blade. But nobody that I knew personally died that day. I wasn't drafted in response. It's part of our nation's response to the event. Largely, life went on as it had with some minor adjustments, but I was affected by it, as I'm sure you were too. I was at that age. I was a few months away from my 20th birthday. I had just returned from a semester away. I'd taken a semester off school, and I'd spent some time hiking and considering the future. I had made some concrete decisions. I'm going to return to school. I had the goal of getting a degree, marrying Cassandra, and not necessarily in that order. In fact, we would be engaged that November. We'd be married the following summer. And in September of 2003, we'd have our first child, Sophie. And that December of 2003, we complete our studies. And all that time frame seems very close together for me at that time, making big life decisions. But even as I contemplated all that was on the horizon, my perspective was altered. I remember laying awake that night, 21 years ago, and I contemplated whether the plan to have kids was a good one. The world seemed turned upside down. Turmoil seemed like the new normal. And I wasn't sure that I could handle the responsibility of raising kids in a world like that. So perhaps every generation feels that. But I felt that especially strong then. Obviously, we did have kids. 2 days ago, in fact, I left Sophie in another state, in a dorm full of strangers, and completely out from under my control. Although, of course, we're never really in control, are we? God gives us tasks, and we act on faith, and we trust that He will take care of the details. Because as we will be reminded today, God is a God of details, and many other things as well. Let's start by reading from 1 Kings 17. No PowerPoint today, so if you turn your Bibles, 1 Kings 17, we're going to start in verse 8 and read through 23. I'm reading from the ESV. 1 Kings 17, starting verse 8. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah. Arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to feed you. So he arose and went to Zarephath. And when he came to the gate of the city, behold, a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, Bring me a little water in a vessel, that I may drink. And as she was going to bring it, he called to her and said, Bring me a morsel of bread in your hand. And she said, As the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour in a jar, and a little oil in a jug. And now I'm gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. Elijah said to her, Do not fear. Go and do as you have said, but first make me a little cake of it and bring it to me, and afterward make something for yourself and your son. For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent, the jug of oil shall not be empty, until the day that the Lord sends rain upon the earth. And she went and did as Elijah said. And she and he and her household ate for many days. The jar of flour was not spent, neither did the jug of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Elijah. After this, the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became ill. His illness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. And she said to Elijah, What have you against me, O man of God? You have come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son. And he said to her, Give me your son. And he took him from her arms, carried him up into the upper chamber where he lodged, and laid him on his own bed. And he cried to the Lord, O Lord my God, have you brought calamity even upon the widow with whom I sojourned by killing her son? Then he stretched himself upon the child 3 times and cried to the Lord, O Lord my God, let this child's life come into him again. And the Lord listened to the voice of Elijah, and the life of the child came into him again, and he revived. And Elijah took the child and brought him down from the upper chamber into the house and delivered him to his mother. And Elijah said, See, your son lives. Sorry. And Jebby had asked if you'd put maybe a cool drink up here. I'm sorry. Thank you, Jebby. There's ice packs and everything. And it is cold. That is better. I guess maybe I should have been more specific when I asked for something cool to drink. You guys might not want to stand too close to me if we talk after the service. Of course, I'm joking. I wouldn't drink vinegar in front of you guys, but I remembered that Russ likes illustrations, so Russ, this is for you. Sometimes when we think that we need a glass of water, God gives us a glass jar of pickle juice, or in this case, a refreshing jar of Mountain Dew. Or Gatorade, or whatever you like to drink that's yellow. Our passage started in the middle of a story. Elijah, if you didn't know, at this point, is fleeing for his life. A catastrophe, partly of his making, has occurred, and now he is running for his life. And he needs protection. He needs a place to stay. He needs provisions for survival, and so God delivers. He's prepared a widow. And if you're Elijah, maybe you're thinking, a rich widow? Rich enough to have food in a time of drought, with rooms to spare and blessings to make up for all the trouble obeying God has put him into. But God gives Elijah a pickle jar. The book of Kings, both parts, are a record of God working on Israel. Beyond their deliverance out of Egypt and into the promised land, the Israelites have now entered a period that could be, or could have been, continued prosperity and growth. But one bad leader leads to another. Solomon's downfall leads to a kingdom split, and both parts seem to forget God entirely. In fact, they start to worship the made-up gods of the lands around them. Baal, or the Baals, as the Old Testament often says, were a series of gods. Literally, Baal means masters or lord of. There were Baals over many aspects of life. And so in this time and region, the Canaanites focused especially on the Baals of fertility and rain or harvest. So, representing the food that they would eat and their future generations, this is what they chose to worship. So in worshiping these made-up gods, the Israelites were choosing to recognize a higher power over certain aspects of life, but they were also choosing to ignore the many other parts that the true God wanted to reign over as well. So in this passage and neighboring ones that we'll read this morning, God's pointing out that he doesn't just rule over the weather, the size of their families, but he also rules over their hearts. He also rules over circumstances and tragedy and hopelessness and anything else that they can think of as well. Look at this passage again. Go to Zarephath. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to feed you. She didn't know it, but God had prepared her. God had commanded her to do his bidding. Just for context, Zarephath's not in Israel. It's in Sidon, which is next door, and even worse, that's the very place, the very region that Queen Jezebel, King Ahab, has gotten off track, way off track. He's doing nothing pleasing to the Lord, and she's a big part of it. Queen Jezebel's from there. She's not from Israel, and this is her hometown. And one of the points being made here in Kings is that God rules the hearts of every man, not just the Elijahs, not just the Israelites, but those in the least likely places as well. And this is how God works too. He's working on her, as he's working on Elijah, as he's working on King Ahab, and he's working on the whole nation. Elijah's pickle jar is a non-Jewish, down to her last meal widow. And he's about to find out that he's got Mountain Dew. She's already acknowledged that Elijah's God exists. Look at verse 12. But Elijah will grow her understanding of who God is and how he works. And in this expression of his understanding how God works, Elijah is having his trust in God reinforced as he is challenging this other person to trust God. Jesus himself references this passage in Luke chapter 4. He's making the point that no prophet is accepted in his hometown. But he says, in truth, I tell you, there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the heavens were shut up 3 years and 6 months, and a great famine came over all the land. And Elijah was sent to none of them, but only to Zarephath, in the land of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. As God is working on the grand scale of holding back the rain and trying to affect the hearts and minds of a whole group of people, he sends his greatest spokesperson to the meager hospitality of a woman who had a seedling of faith. The Lord also rules over interactions. As Israel's forgetting God, they will be shown that God works even in these seemingly unimportant encounters. We don't always get to stay in the spare room of a stranger for 3 years, but don't think that God isn't putting you where he wants you just for his purposes and your good. Because he is also working on the hearts of the ungodly, and he is using you to do it. Her oil and her flour don't run out. Her understanding grows. Elijah is sustained. And then we get this other pickle jar where the woman's son dies. Things are going really good. Even Elijah seems to be frustrated by this. We get this great interaction between Elijah and the widow, but also between Elijah and God. We could have a whole sermon just on praying for things like restoring the life of a dead boy. Was it 3 weeks ago? Jeff asked the question, when do you stop praying for something? When do you start praying for something like this? How do you pray over something with such finality as the death of a person? Do you pray to undo that? Elijah cries out to the Lord. He isn't concerned with himself right now, but for the widow. How might she view God faced with losing the thing most precious to her? So in trying his best to follow the path God has him on, Elijah has fully embraced the mission of turning the heart of this woman to God, and he is smart enough to know he isn't the one turning anything. God controls these things. Does God change his mind here? Chose to have this boy die, now he's going to nope, never mind. I don't think that's what's going on. I think he hears the prayer that he loves to hear, not just the words, but the heart behind it. And he gives Elijah exactly what he asked for. And I deliberately cut this verse off, but look at it now, verse 24 at the end of this passage. The woman says to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is truth." Her heart and her mind are solidified here. Before, she acknowledged that God existed. Now, she believes the message of who he is. And if you need one more layer in which to appreciate God, look at how he spared her son, the most precious thing in her life. And yet he did not spare his own son, the most precious thing to him. In this interaction, we see that the Lord rules over life and death. The Israelites want to worship Baal, the master of fertility. Well, God is saying that he doesn't just bring people into this world, but he can take them out and bring them back before he takes them out again, if he so chooses. Go back to the beginning of chapter 17, before the passage that we started with. I want to go back a section so that we can better see the progression here. Elijah bursts onto the scene in verse 1, telling Ahab, the king of Israel, who has turned away from the true God to worship false gods, the God of rain, the God of the harvest, that there will be no rain, that there will be no harvest for 3 years at the command of God Almighty. He controls the clouds and the crops, but he's also Lord over sustenance. Elijah is in need of sustaining, and once again, God controls circumstances. Just as God commanded a widow to feed Elijah, so here he commands birds to do it. I should have also had some water up here. 1 Kings 17, 1 through 7. Now Elijah the Tishbite of Tishba in Gilead said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word." And the word of the Lord came to him, "Depart from here, turn eastward, and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, which is east of the Jordan. You shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there." So he went and did according to the word of the Lord. He went and lived by the brook Cherith that is east of the Jordan, and the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. And after a while, the brook dried up, because there was no rain in the land. I have commanded the ravens to feed you there. God isn't just nudging things along, he is commanding them. But look at this idea of sustenance. We need sustaining. And we have seen how God provided food and lodging in unlikely circumstances. This passage comes before the other passage. So think back to what God has done before today for you. Have you ever been in a place where you didn't know where the money was going to come from, or the food was going to come from, or the car was going to come from, the the friend was going to come from. How has God sustained us from the past? Because here God is moving Elijah outside of the city, but not yet into enemy territory. God is feeding him through unclean animals. You ever thought about that? They weren't supposed to touch ravens. Here God has ravens feeding him. But he's not yet being provided for through unclean Gentiles, which happens with the widow. She wasn't Jewish. The encounters with the widow seem a little less dramatic when we see this sustaining by the brook. When we get to the widow, Elijah recognizes another pickle jar, but he may not be assuming that there's vinegar in it. We learn to view circumstances differently when we've already been taken through something else. His obedience to God is remarkable, given the overwhelming task that God has for him, but Elijah has already tasted the Mountain Dew, if you will. He's already experienced what God can do through seemingly overwhelming circumstances. And his heart is even more moved toward obedience because God has been growing him each step of the way. Since God is Lord over sustenance, we can't just be #blessed when things are ideal. Bill has said something to this effect at men's study before. We can't thank the Lord for green lights and then curse him for the red ones. When things are going our way, when everything's falling into place, yes, that's when I'm blessed by the Lord. And then look at the less than ideal circumstances and be like, well, where's God now? It's not how he works. Look at Job's perspective after losing just about everything. In Job chapter 1, verse 21, the Lord gave, the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. The brook dries up, but immediately after, go to Sidon, for I have commanded a widow there to feed you. The question can be asked, if the brook was preparing Elijah for Sidon, then what is Sidon preparing him for? And what follows in chapter 18 is the big reveal. This is where God really throws down and leaves no doubt in the minds of the people, both Jew and Gentile, that he is ruler of everything. And he's still working on hearts. Look at 18, starting in verse 17. When Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to him, "Is it you, you troubler of Israel?" And he answered, "I have not troubled Israel, but you have, and your father's house, because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals. Now therefore send and gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, and the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table." So Ahab sent to all the people of Israel and gathered the prophets together at Mount Carmel. And Elijah came near to the people and said, "How long will you go limping between two different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him." And the people did not answer him a word. Then Elijah said to the people, "I, even I only, am left a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. Let 2 bulls be given to us, and let them choose 1 bull for themselves and cut it in pieces and lay it on the wood, but put no fire to it. And I will prepare the other bull and lay it on the wood, and put no fire to it. And you call upon the name of your God, and I will call upon the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, he is God." And all the people answered, "That's a good idea. This is well spoken." I'm not going to read the whole account here. Hopefully you have all heard it before. If you haven't, read it today. David versus Goliath isn't the only David and Goliath story in the Bible. There are several things to note from this passage and the following passage. Even as the nation and its leadership have walked away from the Lord, they still show up for this display. Regardless of their reasons, they want to see power. And the true God is going to show it overwhelmingly. As Elijah said, get off the fence. If the God of Israel is the true God, then follow him. This is what God wants. He wants to be followed. He has always wanted Israel to have no other gods before him, to love him and obey him, to walk in his ways, to have a heart after his heart. So when Elijah lays out the challenge, all the people say, this is good. Let's do this. And I don't think this is just people wanting a good show. They've been in the middle of a famine. They've created convenient gods for themselves that are not delivering. They're not fulfilling or filling the God-shaped hole that is in their lives. People do this today. Look at the litany of sins that the church has convinced itself God's really okay with, despite what his word says. Instead of saying, come as you are, the modern church has said, stay as you are. It is easy to see then that God quickly fails to serve a purpose. If God is completely fine with everything I am doing, then what do I need him for? Throughout the showdown between Elijah and the prophets of Baal, it says that the prophets of Baal did all kinds of things to get Baal's attention. They cut themselves, scream, wail, they did it on and on and on. And you get a little bit of this, I don't know if you'd call it comedic, but Elijah's like, oh, maybe he's asleep. Oh, louder. Just get in it. He knows it's fruitless. But do what you're going to do. They believed that Baal would sometimes leave and go to different places, and so they got to get their attention. They had all kinds of theories to explain his absence, but in reality, they had created a god like themselves. A fickle God. God that's prone to wander. God that's inattentive. The upside of a God like that is that he's seemingly uninterested. You can get away with way more. The downside is that he's uninterested. There's no relationship with a God like that. Elijah is a messenger calling a people back to knowing and following a God who never leaves or forsakes, who never doesn't care, who has standards we can't meet on our own, and he loves us anyway. He helps us when we cry out to him. The true God is also Lord of the miraculous, the Lord of overwhelming odds. We love these underdog stories, and God must love them too because he orchestrates them. Elijah is alone. There are 450 prophets of Baal and 400 other prophets. They get to go first. Their altar is dry. They get the first choice of cows. Elijah says in verse 30 to the people of Israel, come near to me. And they come near to him. And they watch him rebuild the altar to the Lord. And they don't stop him from doing it. And they watch as he lays out a sacrifice. And he dumps water all over it. And he digs a trench around it. And he fills that with water. 3 times water is dumped on the sacrifice. There will be no doubt that a fire that can consume this sacrifice can only come from the true God. And of course it does. And the pinnacle verses are right before God demonstrates to everyone again who he is. Look at 1 Kings 18, verse 36 and 37. Elijah prays and he asks God that 2 things would happen. Verse 36, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant and that I've done all these things at your word. This is the first thing. He wants God to demonstrate who he, God, is. Not because he hasn't before, but because a hard-hearted people need reminding. And the second thing is in verse 37. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back. God in heaven is not just Lord over everything, in the sense of withholding rain and causing animals to feed humans and allowing a jar of oil to never run dry and even consuming with fire a soaking wet altar. He's also Lord over the hearts of men. He says, you have turned their hearts back. Verse 38, and the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust and licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and they said, the Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God. This is the widow on a grander scale. Her son was restored, and she knew who Elijah's God was and believed. Here, everyone on that mountain experienced publicly and powerfully not just what God could do out there, but also what he could do in here. Baal was not a god of the heart. He wasn't even God of fertility and rain. He was made up. But even in the creating of a god in their likeness, they didn't create a god of the heart. This isn't the end of the story. The Lord ends the drought. And if this were a movie, perhaps the closing scene would be Elijah standing in pouring rain, face toward heaven, smiling as his mission is accomplished. And God has been restored to his proper place in the hearts of the people. But we often forget chapter 19. And again, I'm not going to read the whole thing. Please read it later on your own. But it starts with Jezebel, Ahab's wife, and perhaps the one that's really pulling the strings, sending a message to Elijah that she's not going to rest until he's dead. So he has this pinnacle moment. Next thing you know, he's on the run again, and he goes into the wilderness, and he sits under a tree, and he asks God to let him die. And I think it's important to see this side of things. After the great victory in which everyone sees that God is powerful, and Elijah truly represents that God, that he's exhausted. And God has this great conversation with him. He comes and he asks Elijah what he's doing. And in verse 19, Elijah says, I've been very jealous for the Lord, the God of hosts. For the people of Israel have forsaken your covenant. They have thrown down your altars, killed your prophets with the sword, and I, even I, only am left. And they seek my life to take it away. He uses this phrase a lot. I, only I, alone on an island doing this thing for the Lord. And the Lord has him stand on a mountain. And then he sends three things past him. They're just demonstrations, reiterances of his power. There's a strong wind. And it says, and God wasn't in it. And an earthquake. And God wasn't in it. And a great fire. All these things go past him, and God wasn't in it. But after that, there's a low whisper. And the Lord was in it. And he asks Elijah quietly again, what are you doing here? And he says the same thing. I alone am left. I've been jealous for the Lord. My life is in danger. And this is my favorite part of this whole story. Before I read on, I absolutely want to give this admonition. Trust God with the hearts of the people around you. Do what he has tasked you with, but leave the hearts to God. You aren't controlling anybody's heart. Not even your kids. I haven't cried yet about losing a daughter out of my house, partly because it hasn't set in yet, but also partly because it's a natural thing. Kids grow up. They make their own way in the world, and the big part's over. You kind of launch them, and you don't have to be there every day anymore. I'll still have a role in her life, but it's not going to be the same. And I was never in control anyway. God always was. God is now. But the second admonition here, and this comes from Elijah himself, run after God. What are you doing, stumbling back and forth? Don't limp Run. Don't limp between two opinions. Follow the one you know to be truth. Even in running, we can certainly feel alone, not just in the low times, but immediately after the high ones. We can often be overwhelmed. And here again is where God reminds that he is a God of the heart, not just the collective hearts of a nation, not just the God of the widow with unlikely faith in an unlikely place. All along, he has been drawing the heart of Elijah as well. It's like God is saying, you have done all that I have asked. You've completed this incredibly hard mission, and it seems like nothing has changed. I get that. The people saw my power, and yet you are still running for your life, and externally, not much has changed. And this is my favorite part, because it shows just how incredible God is to work out his plans while simultaneously affecting the whole nation and still caring for these individual needs, these individual relationships. God has whispered quietly to Elijah, and now God shows him what is in store next. Look at 19:15. And the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, and Jehu, the son of Nimshi, you shall anoint to be king over Israel. And Elisha, the son of Shaphat, you shall anoint to be prophet in your place. And the one who escapes from the sword of Hazael shall Jehu put to death, and the one who escapes from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha put to death. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." Three things here. God's about to send Elijah on another mission. He will use Elijah to anoint new political leadership. It has not immediately changed, it is about to change. Doesn't mean it will be perfect, but change is coming and he's going to be part of it. Second thing, he will use Elijah to anoint a successor. Immediately after this, he goes and finds Elisha. And one that is just as jealous for the Lord as he has been. And the third thing, God is preserving a remnant. How many times did Elisha say, "I alone, I alone"? The Lord gives Elijah this insight. God is working on a much grander scale than what Elijah or we can even imagine. All this turmoil in the kingdom, all of these problems with God's people not following God, it's all building up to something greater, setting the stage for the coming Messiah. And Elijah has done what God needs at this point to serve that purpose. And he is gracious to allow Elijah to see a change in leadership. And he is gracious to allow Elijah to see his legacy carried on. And he is gracious to allow Elijah to know that in all those times, when he thought he was alone, and was still faithful to God, that God had preserved 7,000 people like him. And that gets me a little choked up, because God isn't working in our hearts alone. Your heart, he's encouraging. It is really encouraging to know that we are seeking after God with so many others at the same time. Let us remain steadfast as God is steadfast, and let us pray fervently for the work God is doing in the hearts of our friends and our coworkers and our neighbors and our children. And let us remain faithful to the work that he has for us, even when we feel alone, even though we never are. Let's close in prayer. Lord, we're just so moved to know that you aren't thinking only of what it is that you're trying to do. It is all what you're trying to do, but you're working on a big scale and a small scale. You care about us individually. You care about what we're thinking and what we're feeling about you and about life in regards to how we live it. As people who are trying to follow you. And it's hard, and we don't even as we're trying to obey and we see the path that we think, like, this must be what you're trying to do, sometimes we get people and opportunities that just feel like that's not what I was asking for. But you're working on those things too, and there's a lot of people that need to see the conviction and hard work of people that are seeking to run after you wholeheartedly. We want to be those people. We want to do the things that you have for us and not get so wrapped up in what we've made out to be our own gods and the things that are so important to us that just aren't eternal. So thank you for loving us. Thank you for saving us. Thank you for encouraging us. Thank you for the people you put around us. Thank you for the missions that you have us on, for the places you have us and the places you'll send us. We love you. Thank you. Amen.